Okay, today we're going to look at prepositional phrases that are used to express time, specifically to describe a chart. Before we start, let's look at an overview of the prepositions that we'll be studying. The first one is by, from, through, after, since, over, during, the course of, over, in, the past, the last, over, in, the next, and for. Okay, now today we're going to be looking at this chart right here. This chart represents the average immigration to the U.S. by decade. Let's quickly talk a little bit about this chart. In our y-axis, that's the vertical axis. The y-axis, that is the vertical axis, represents the number of people who immigrate to America by the hundreds of thousands. The x-axis, as you can see, represents time. The x-axis here represents time divided by decades. So let's get started now. Let's look at by plus specific time. By plus specific time is used to specify a time when an action is fulfilled. So you can see right here that in the year 2000, in the 2010s and 2000s, immigration to the United States surpassed 1 million per year, per decade. So we can use that here to say by the early 2000s, the number of people migrating to America surpassed 1 million per decade. Here, the fulfilling action is the surpassing 1 million per decade. That's what the action that was fulfilled. Okay, the next one is from specific through specific time. These are used to specify the times between when an action occurred. So as you can see right here, it starts in the 1900s and ends in the 1930s. Okay, so we're talking about an action from the 1900s to the 1930s. So what is that? From the 1900s through the 1930s, immigration to the United States fell. You can see it falling right here. All right, the next one is after and since plus a specific time. These are used to specify a time for starting or ending of an action. Okay, so we're going to start right here, and we're looking at the 1930s, since and after the 1930s. So after the 1930s, immigration to the United States began. Okay, we're looking at the start of an action, began to rise. We also have since the 1930s, immigration to the United States has been rising. Okay, as well, I mentioned that it can also be used, after and since can be used for the end of an action. So right here, we're starting from the 1900s to 1930s, again in the 1930s. So we can say after the 1930s, immigration to the United States stopped. That means it ended falling, stopped its fall, ended its fall. Okay, stopped falling. We can also say since the 1930s, immigration to the United States has stopped falling. Okay, so from the 1900s to 1930s, it was falling, but this falling action stopped since the 1930s, after the 1930s. Okay, let's move on now. We can use over and during the course of plus specific time. This is used to specify a time when an action progresses. So here is from the 1820s all the way up to the 1890s. And we're looking at the 19th century. So during the course of the 19th century, that is from the 1800s to 1900s, immigration to the United States rose. Okay, from the 19th century, from the 1800s right up to the 1900. Okay, moving on now. Then we have for, over, in, the past, and the last. These are used to specify the length of time when a past action occurred. Okay, so we're looking again at our the last 2 decades, and you can use for the past, or over the past, or in the past, or you can say for the last, or over the last, or in the last, and then you add a time period. So for example, I could say over the past 2 decades, immigration to the United States has been surpassing 1 million per decade. Okay, there we go. That's the past 2 decades. Okay, when an action was progressing here. We can also say for, over, in, the next, plus a time period. These are used to specify when an action progresses. It doesn't have to be in the past. This is different for the next is different from the past and the last, because the past and last is only for a past action. Okay, the next is slightly different, and we'll talk about that right now. So 2200s, can be looking at 2020s, the next decade. So we can say in the next decade, that means talking about the future. Immigration to the United States will continue to surpass 1 million per decade. Here we have will. We're talking about the future. Okay. However, there is an exception though to this rule. Okay. We don't just use the next for the future. We can also use it for the past. Okay. But in this situation, you're going to be looking at two sentences. Okay. So for example, by the early 2000s, the number of people migrating to America surpassed 1 million per decade. Okay, then in the next decade, immigration to the United States continued to surpass 1 million per decade. So what we have going on here is in the next decade is still occurs in the past, but why is that? It's because we have by the early 2000s, the next decade from the early 2000s was the 2010s, and that's in the past. So what I'm trying to say is the next can be used as a past time reference, that is the 2010s here, if it is after or if it is after a prior time reference. Okay, to a prior time reference, that is 2000s. Okay, the last one is for plus a time period. This is used to specify the length of time when an action occurs, progresses. So again, for 2 decades, immigration to the United States has surpassed 1 million per decade. Okay, that concludes this. A quick summary. We use by to specify a time when an action is fulfilled. We use from plus specific time through specific time, and that is used to specify times between when an action occurred. After and since is used to specify time for the starting or ending of an action. Over during the course of a specific time is used to specify a time when an action progresses. For over in the past, the last plus the time period is used to specify the length of time when a past action progressed. For over in the next plus the time period is used to specify the length of time when an action progresses, and for to plus time period. Okay. The most important one to remember between the last three is that the last is used only for past actions. And this is my reference for that average immigration to the U.S. by decade chart. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Please have a wonderful afternoon. I look forward to seeing you in class. If you have any thoughts, questions, or concerns, please email me.